Hey, welcome back to another great video. So today we are going to see exactly how we can insert JSON data into a Postgres DB through JPA or Spring Boot. Of course, I will create a REST API, I will create controllers, services, and everything that we need throughout the process. So stay tuned, stay with me, and we'll get this done. Okay. So here on the screen, you might already be able to see that I have created a basic DB, dummy DB, and inside the dummy DB, we have a table called dummy table, right? So dummy table basically has two things. The one of them is ID, which is a number, and another one is data, which is of type JSONB. Okay, so let me just show it to you here as well. So if I show you the table here in the properties section, you can see we have an ID, we have a data, right? So the JSONB data type that I have used comes built in with Postgres. You can use the other one that Postgres provides, that is JSON. So both of them work in a similar fashion. They have technically no differences except the fact that JSONB is more scalable when you have a lot of updates and a lot of alters on the table. So in that scenarios, use JSONB when your write frequency is higher because it gives better performance. It uses binary data type internally, but that is not the scope of the video right now. So anyway, bottom line is I have created a table called dummy table which has a column called data that is of type JSONB. Now our aim is to put JSON data or JSON string basically inside this particular column, that is the data column, right? Okay, so as I said, we will be using Eclipse for doing that, right? We will be using Spring Boot for doing that. So let us open up our Eclipse and get started. So here in Eclipse, you must be seeing that I have already created a basic project. So this project is almost empty right now. It is brand new. So few things that I have done is I have created a few packages. There's a default package called demo that has our demo application, the basic Spring Boot starter. I have controller package, I have entities package, a package for repository, a package for services. There are no classes in it right now, but we will be filling them in. Okay. So in terms of your dependencies that you need, so make sure you have those installed or have those added in your pom.xml. So let me take you through them very quickly. So one of the dependency that we need is Spring Boot starter data JPA. So this is important because of course we need JPA to communicate with our database. So that is one thing. Second is have Spring Boot Starter web installed because this will allow us to create REST APIs that will further call the methods that we have created internally, right, to communicate with our database. Then you don't really need Spring Boot Starter test, but if you want to write test cases in the future, it is good to have one. One last thing that you will need is PostgreSQL if you are using Postgres DB, right? So PostgreSQL is needed because it comes with the Postgres driver that is needed to communicate with our database through Spring Boot. Okay, so that's all on pom.xml side. Now, for you have a database, right? You need to connect it with your backend project. How do you do that? So for that, you need an application.properties file. So the application.properties file is usually located in src main resources, and inside that you will find the application.properties file. Now inside this file, there are few things that you need to add, right? So first thing is the data source URL. Now what is a data source URL? A data source URL is basically the JDBC URL for your project. So a few things that to see here is that JDBC colon will be common everywhere. This will change based on what database you use. So I'm using Postgres, that's why it is saying PostgreSQL, right? Now the host. So for example, I am currently communicating with my local host Postgres that I have installed on this machine. But you might also want to communicate with some other Postgres that is hosted on a public URL, right? So you need to replace it with the IP address of that public URL. The port is usually going to stay the same until unless you explicitly start Postgres on a different port. So 5432 is the default port for Postgres DB. Then the dummy DB here is the database that I had created inside which the dummy table exists. So make sure you put the database name correct. Okay. So this consists of what a data source URL is. Then further, the username and password should be what you use for your particular database. So I have a username called Postgres which has a password called Postgres. So I had created it just for this particular demo, right? And few other stuff. What driver you need to use, you need to mention that using driver class name. Yeah, I will be using Postgres dialect as well, since of course I'm using the Postgres driver. Then few other small things, whether you want to show the SQL that is going to be executed on the DB while it is getting executed in the console. So I do want that. So I have done show SQL as true. And Hibernate DDL strategy, that I have kept to none because I don't want my code to change the schema of the table unless I explicitly say so. Okay, so I don't want it automatically to change the schema. So basically that is the summary of application.properties. I feel that it is pretty straightforward, and if you have already connected your database to a backend server previously, you might already be knowing what most of this stuff mean. So let's move on to the actual gravy part of this dish, right? So first things first that you need to create is an entity. Okay, so let's go ahead and create an entity. To people who are doing it for the first time, basically an entity means a class representation of the table, right? So let me show you a Java class representation of your table. So let me show you exactly what I mean. So once I write the code, it will be very clear for you. Okay, so I will just create a dummy table. Okay, so I have created a class called dummy table, right? I will, since we are creating an entity, I will mark it with an annotation called entity. This tells JavaScript and Hibernate, this tells Java and Hibernate that this particular class is an entity, and then it will start treating it as a connection to, as corresponding to a table. Okay, so as I said, this is regarding a table. We need to tell this particular code it is regarding which table. So to do that, we have another entity called table. So I use entity called table. Now inside a table annotation, you have a key called name. So here you put the name of your particular table that you are going to communicate with, or basically the table that this class corresponds to. Okay, so what is the name of our table? The name of our table is dummy table. Okay, I hope I am correct, right? So the name of our table, yeah, it is a dummy table. Cool. So I have given the name of the table. This is good enough. Now we have two columns in our table. One is an ID. So I will create first two columns. I will create, so for each column, basically in an entity class, a variable is assigned, right? So if you remember, in our database, the first column that we have is an ID column with data type integer. So let us create an integer ID. Okay. And the second column that we had was of type JSON, right? Now, before going to JSON, let us first make sure that everything is set up properly for ID. Okay. Now to do that, you click on column. Okay. And okay, so with this column annotation, of course, the same way we mark the particular class as a table, I am marking this particular variable as a column. Now when I mark something as a column, I need to tell it what is the name of the particular column that it represents. Even though you don't, it is okay, but if you don't, it will consider this particular variable name as the column name. So it is the best practice to just tell it explicitly what a column is. Now the ID that I'm using is a primary key, right? So that's why I need to also mention that this particular column is also an ID. So when I do that, I need to use an annotation called @ID. Also, yeah, you can observe that all of these annotations that I'm using are coming from Jakarta persistence, right? So make sure that when you add these annotations, you import it from the right packages. Okay, so now we have our ID column set up. Now let's go to the JSON column, right? So to do that, let's start. So the data type that you need to use to make sure that all the communication that are happening for JSON, for a JSON type, you need to use string, right? So I know you might be confused why string, because Java does not support JSON as a data type out of the box, right? So to do that, what to do is you use a string and then you parse it into a JSONB object while pushing it into the database. Now I will show you how we do that as well. But right now, let's create a string variable. So I created a string. The name of our column in our dummy table was data. So I create a variable called data, right? And I mark it as a column in similar fashion as we did for ID. Column name is equal to ID. Okay. Now here we need to use one more field, that is column definition, right? And we need to make sure to tell it specifically that this is of a JSON type. So since it is of a special type that Java does not support out of the box, we need to specifically tell it that this column is of type JSONB. Okay. And as I told you, since it is a string and you need to transform it into a JSONB object while parsing. So we will need a column transformer basically. So let's add a column transformer. All right. Now inside a column transformer, you will use a field called write so that it casts this particular entry into a different type while writing. And we will, for this, Postgres or Hibernate technically gives you a particular format, right? So we will write question mark colon colon JSON B. Now why did I write that? Okay, so let me tell you why I wrote this particular thing. So basically a question mark represents the data you are trying to insert, which is of type string. Okay, then colon colon is basically representing typecasting. Okay, and JSONB here is basically the target data type we wish our data to be transformed to. Okay, so that's why basically this is your data in string, then you are typecasting it into a JSONB. So yeah, that's the basic logic for it. So now you have both the column set up in the entity, right? Few other things that you would need is make sure that you have created getters and setters as well as yeah, your constructor in the particular class, because that is how Hibernate will be communicating with this class by default. So to do that, just right click, go to source and generate getters and setters, select all and generate those getter and setter. So getter and setter are basically method that just either add stuff into to the particular variables or take stuff out of them. Okay. Now one more thing that you will need is make sure to create a constructor, of course. So I'm making one here. right? Okay, let us generate a constructor. So you can see the constructor is also generated. Okay, so this right here seems good enough for our entity, right? So the next thing that we need is we need a repository. Now, to the ones who are hearing this term for the first time, let me fill you in what a repository is. So here I am creating a dummy table repository. Okay, so basically a repository, oh by the way, it should be an interface, yeah. So basically a repository usually is responsible for providing all the methods that are necessary for communicating, for doing operations on your database. So it if usually what we do is we create an interface called interface that will act as a repository, which essentially extends JPA repository, right? Now this JPA repository comes along with a lot of helpful methods, especially CRUD operations that we can directly call and perform on our particular entity that we provide, right? So as I said, it will perform operations on the entity. So what two things that it will need as an input is that one, what entity you want it to act. So the entity that we want it to act on is dummy table, of course. And second is the data type for its ID, right? So it is asking this particular information because it needs to uniquely identify each record that it is going to perform the operation on, right? So what is the data type of our identity? It is an integer. So yeah, here you can see that we have set up a basically dummy table repository. One more thing that you should remember is make sure you mark this particular interface as a repository, right? The same way you mark the entities. Now, what we do is we have a repository in place which communicates with our entity. Now we need to use this repository to basically insert information into our table, right? So for that I create a service. Okay, so this service is basically, it is just a class that has all the methods regarding a particular uh, I would say context. So right now my context is all the operations regarding the mutable. So I have just created a helper class basically that does all the processing and calls all the necessary methods to make my operation happen, right? So I'm creating a dummy table service. Okay, now the same way as I mentioned, at the rate entity, at the rate repository, I am going to mark this class as at the rate service, so that Java knows that this is a service. Okay, now what I need is just one method, that is add record to table. Okay, yeah, seems logical enough, right? Now as I said, we need to use repository in this particular service to make sure our insert happens, right? So let us create a object for repository. So to do that, dummy table repository and dummy table repository. Okay, and use an annotation called auto-wired. Now why did I use auto-wired? Because it gives me an object of dummy table repository by default, right? Using the basic constructor that we mentioned. Yeah, you don't really necessarily have to use auto-wired here, but it saves you some piece of code. Okay, now since I've created a dummy table repository, it comes with a method called save, right? So save accepts an entity, and basically when you call save, it inserts this particular entity into your this particular record into your table, right? So what entity will it accept? Of course, it will accept a dummy table entity, right? So let's create a dummy table entity as an input to this particular method. Okay, and dummy table and dummy table. Okay, and just give it to this particular method. Yep. Okay, so everything seems fine. We have created a method that accepts the object of type dummy table, and it basically calls the repository to save this particular object into our database. Okay, now one and final thing that we need to do is we need to create an API that basically calls this method. So let us go ahead and do that. So I'll create a class and dummy table controller. Okay, as I said, everything should be marked with proper annotations. We will mark this one with an annotation called controller. Now, since we are putting information into our DB, I will create a put method. So to create a put method, you need to use an annotation called put mapping, right? Now, what does put mapping accept as an input? It accepts the path of the API that you are going to create. So I will create an API at slash add record. Okay, cool. Then let us create a method that will represent the logic for this particular API. So I will return a string and record. Okay, let it be like this, right? So now inside this we need to call the dummy table service that we had created. So let us just create an auto-wired object for dummy table service the same way we did for repository. Let us do that. Dummy table service. Okay. Okay. And in, inside dummy table service, we had a method called add record to table. Cool. Now this seems very straightforward. Now, if you remember right, this method accepts a variable or an object of type dummy table. So let us create an object of type dummy table. We can simply do it by calling the constructor of of dummy table. Now it accepts two things. First one that it accepts was an ID. So I will use an ID 1. Okay. And second one that it accepts is a JSON string. So let me put in a JSON string. Okay. Key and value. Be sure to mark all these. Be sure to mark all these double quotations that you are using with slash so that it doesn't end the particular string. Okay, so now you can see that it is all in one complete string and it is a JSON with key as a key and value as a value. I know, less creative, whatever. So anyway, once this is done, I want this particular API to return record created successfully. Okay, I hope the spelling is correct. I am not really sure of the word successfully here. So anyway, okay, everything seems fine. Cool. So let us now start this particular project. To run this particular project, click on run as and go to Java application. So you can see the particular project has started booting up. Okay, we have an error here. Okay, it is saying that in dummy table we have a duplicate entity called ID. Oh, okay. So you can see that actually we mentioned ID twice here. Instead, we need to give the name as data. Okay. Okay. That is a mistake on my part. Anyway, now let's see if something else comes along. Okay. So you can see here that the particular demo application has started, as well as the Tomcat server is up on 8080 port. Cool. Now let us go ahead and check it out and in Postman. Okay, so here we are at our Postman. You can see that I'm calling the add record API here. We are using the put method, as well as the port is correct, and since I'm doing it locally, so that's why the host is localhost. So let us go ahead and call this particular method. Okay, it is saying that we have some error, so let us debug what the error is. Okay, so the error that we got is there is no default constructor for table dummy table. So you see, that's why I told you that we need to have these default constructors and other constructors in place. So we created a constructor with fields, but we didn't create a default constructor. So let us go ahead, create one. To do that, simply go to source and go down below to click on generate constructor from superclass. So this will create a default constructor for us. Now we have a default constructor. So let us restart our application. So there are various variety of issues that you will come across while creating these applications, but you need to make sure that you debug them properly. Usually errors in Java are pretty descriptive, so they are clear cut to the point what might be the reason. Okay, so let's jump back to our Postman and try once again if this works. Okay, I'll call the same API again. Okay, so you can see that the particular action has been completed on Hibernate and insert has took place. So let's check out in our DB whether this information was updated or not. So you can see this is your older older state of the table. So now we will refresh this particular table to see whether our entries are added or not. So once I click on refresh, you can see a new entry has been added with ID 1, and yeah, well, this is the particular value that we had added into the we wanted to add into this particular table. So you have successfully added information in a JSONB column of a Postgres table from your Springboot API basically. So yeah, that's all for today. Have a great day, and make sure to subscribe, make sure to like the video, make sure to share it with anybody who needs it across team. So we are at 3 subscribers right now. I'm aiming to gain at least 47 more to reach the number of 50. 50 sounds like good number. So yeah, make sure to subscribe, make sure to support me on my journey. See you next time.